They sold my home. Without asking, the ending shocked everyone. The day I found out my home was sold, I was standing alone in the kitchen, holding a warm cup of tea with both hands, the way I always did when I wanted to feel steady. The steam rose slowly, brushing my face, fogging my glasses just a little. The kettle behind me was still humming, making that soft, familiar sound it always made when it was almost finished boiling. It was a sound I had heard thousands of times before, a sound that used to mean comfort, routine, safety. The morning light came through the window the same way it always had, pale and gentle, touching the edges of the table, the sink, the old curtain I had never bothered to replace. Everything looked normal. Everything felt normal, until it didn't. I remember thinking about nothing important at all. I was wondering if I should add a little more sugar. I was thinking about the ache in my knees and how the weather might change later in the day. My mind was quiet, peaceful. That peace lasted only a few seconds, but I remember it clearly because it was the last moment before my life shifted in a way I never expected. My daughter-in-law was standing near the doorway. I hadn't even noticed her come in. She didn't look angry. She didn't look nervous either. Her face was calm, almost flat, like someone who had already practiced the words in their head and was simply waiting for the right moment to say them. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't sigh. She didn't argue or soften her tone. She spoke the way someone speaks when they are talking about something small and ordinary, something that doesn't really matter. "We sold the house," she said. For a second, I honestly thought I had heard her wrong. The words didn't make sense together. Sold the house. My house. The house I was standing in. I turned slightly, still holding my cup, and looked at her, waiting for the rest of the sentence. I expected her to laugh and say she was joking, or to explain that she meant something else. But she didn't. "You'll need to find somewhere else," she added, her voice just as calm, just as distant, as if she were talking about rearranging furniture or changing dinner plans. I felt my face move before my heart did. My lips curved into a small smile, the kind of smile you give when you don't want to seem difficult, the kind of smile I had learned to wear over many years of keeping peace. I smiled not because I understood, and not because I was okay, but because my heart had suddenly frozen like it had been dropped into cold water. Everything inside me went still. I couldn't feel anger. I couldn't feel sadness. I couldn't even feel fear. There was only a heavy, quiet shock that spread slowly through my chest. I took a careful sip of my tea, even though my hands were shaking. I didn't want her to notice. I didn't want anyone to notice. The tea tasted the same as it always had, but somehow it felt wrong, like I was drinking it in someone else's kitchen, in someone else's life. I had lived in that house for 37 years, 37 long, full years. I remembered the day we moved in, how empty it had been, how the walls echoed when we spoke. I remembered sleeping on the floor that first night with nothing but a thin blanket and a lot of hope. I remembered painting the walls by hand, choosing colors that felt warm and safe. I remembered standing in that same kitchen, years earlier, holding my bobbies on my hip while stirring soup on the stove. I remembered birthday cakes on that table, late-night talks, quiet mornings, loud afternoons. I raised my children there. I watched them learn to walk across that floor, fall, cry, and get back up again. I marked their heights on the wall, one small line every year, their names written beside them in faded pen. I washed their school clothes in that house, packed their lunches, waited up at night when they were late coming home. Every part of my life had passed through those rooms. I buried my husband from there too. I remember sitting alone on the edge of the bed after the funeral, listening to the silence he left behind. I remember walking through the house at night, touching the door frames, the counters, the places where his hands had once rested. That house held my grief. It held my healing. It held my memories when I didn't know where else to put them. And yet, standing there in that kitchen, holding that cup of tea, I realized something that hurt more deeply than I could explain. I realized that none of those memories had protected me. None of those years had given me a voice. None of that love had earned me a place in the decision. I was no longer part of the conversation. No one had asked me what I wanted. No one had sat me down and explained anything. No one had warned me that this moment was coming. The decision had been made somewhere else, in another room, in another time, without me. And I was hearing about it the way you hear about a canceled appointment or a change in plans. I nodded slowly, still smiling, still quiet. I told myself to stay calm. I told myself not to cry. I told myself that maybe this was normal, that maybe this was just how things were when you got older. Inside, though, something deep and fragile was breaking, not loudly, not all at once, but slowly like a crack spreading through glass. In that moment, I understood something painful and clear. I understood that the house had stopped being my home long before it was sold. It had stopped being mine the moment my voice stopped mattering. The moment my presence became something that could be worked around instead of included. That was the moment everything changed. Not with shouting, not with anger, not with slammed doors, but with a quiet sentence spoken in a calm voice in a familiar kitchen while the kettle hummed and the tea cooled in my hands. That house was never fancy, and I never needed it to be. The paint chipped in places where time and weather had done their quiet work. The floor creaked when you walked at night, especially near the hallway, a soft groan that used to tell me someone was awake, someone was moving, someone was still there with me. To other people, those sounds might have been annoying. To me, they were proof of life, proof that the house was breathing along with us. The windows were old, and on cold mornings I could feel the chill slipping through the edges. In the summer, the ceiling fan rattled a little too loudly, like it had something to complain about. But none of that mattered, because the house held us. It protected us. It knew us. Every corner carried a memory, even the quiet ones that didn't have words attached to them. The kind of memories that live in your body instead of your mind. My husband and I bought that house when we were young and full of dreams but short on money. We didn't walk in with confidence. We walked in holding hands, whispering to each other, wondering if we were making a mistake. We had nothing but hope and borrowed money, and even that borrowed money felt heavy in our pockets. The roof leaked a little. The yard was uneven. But we stood in the living room and looked at each other and smiled, because somehow we knew this place would hold our future. We planted the tree in the front yard ourselves. I remember how small it looked, just a thin trunk and a few hopeful leaves. My husband joked that it might not survive. I told him it would grow with us. We pressed the soil down with our hands, laughing, dirty, tired, and happy. That tree grew taller every year, just like our children did. Every time I looked at it, I felt rooted, like I belonged right there. Inside the house, life unfolded slowly and then all at once. The walls heard arguments and apologies. They heard laughter late at night and crying early in the morning. They heard prayers whispered when things felt uncertain. I cooked meals in that kitchen until I could do it without thinking, my hands moving on their own, guided by habit and love. The smell of soup and bread filled the rooms, wrapping around us like a promise that no matter what happened outside, we would be okay inside. When my husband died, the house became my anchor. The world outside felt unstable, like it could tilt at any moment, but the house stayed where it was. The furniture stayed in place. The walls stayed strong. I stayed because I didn't know where else to go. Grief made everything feel heavy, so I kept myself busy. I cooked even when I wasn't hungry. I cleaned even when the house was already clean. I folded laundry slowly, carefully, as if each movement mattered. I talked to his photo like he was still listening. I told him about my day. I told him about the weather, about the bills, about how quiet the nights felt without him. Sometimes I laughed while I talked, and sometimes I cried. The house held those moments too. It didn't judge me. It didn't rush me. It just listened, the way it always had. Years passed and my children grew older. They built lives of their own. I stayed in the house, keeping it alive, keeping it warm. I fixed what I could. I ignored what I couldn't. I learned to live with less noise and more silence. I told myself I was fine. Most days I was. Then one day, my son sat with me at the table and asked me to move in with him and his wife. He said it would be easier for me. He said I wouldn't have to worry about repairs or bills anymore. He said they would take care of me. His voice was gentle and his eyes looked sincere. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this was love speaking, not convenience. I looked around the kitchen while he talked. I looked at the marks on the wall, the cabinets I had wiped down thousands of times, the chair where my husband used to sit. My heart felt heavy, but I told myself this was what families did. They stayed together. They helped each other. I told myself it would only be a change of place, not a loss. I believed him, because that's what mothers do. We believe our children, even when something inside us feels unsure. We believe because we spent our lives teaching them to be honest, to be kind. We believe because admitting doubt feels like admitting failure. There were papers to sign. They were placed in front of me neatly, with pens ready. I didn't understand everything written there. The words were small and formal, full of meanings that didn't feel real at the time. I trusted the people I raised. I trusted my son's smile. I trusted the calm way everything was presented to me, like it was all just a formality. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I didn't need to read every line. I told myself family wouldn't hurt me. And slowly, without realizing it, the house stopped being mine. It didn't happen in one moment. It happened quietly, the way important things often do. Decisions were made without my input. Conversations happened when I wasn't in the room. The house I had built with love began to feel like something I was borrowing, something I needed permission to stay in. I didn't notice right away. Or maybe I did, and I chose not to see it. Because seeing it would have meant admitting that the place I gave my life to was slipping out of my hands. And that kind of truth is hard to hold when you have already given so much of yourself away. At first, it was little things, so small that I almost felt silly noticing them. My chair was moved from the corner where I always sat in the evenings. It wasn't gone, just placed closer to the wall as if it needed to be out of the way. I told myself it didn't matter. A chair was just a chair. Still, when I went to sit down that night, my body hesitated for a moment, confused, like it was looking for something familiar and couldn't quite find it. Then my dishes were boxed away. Not all at once, just a few at first. The old plates with tiny cracks that I knew by heart. The cups I always reached for without thinking. I opened a cabinet one morning and found empty space where my things used to be. When I asked about it, she smiled softly and said, "You don't need these anymore." Her voice was gentle, almost kind, like she was helping me. I nodded. I didn't want to cause trouble. I didn't want to seem ungrateful or difficult. So I closed the cabinet and told myself I could use the other dishes just as easily. But small changes have a way of piling up quietly. One day the shelf in the bathroom was cleared, my bottles lined up neatly in a box under the sink. Another day, my coat was moved to a different closet, one farther from the door. My routines began to shift without anyone asking me if that was okay. Each time, I told myself it was nothing. Each time, I swallowed the strange feeling that rose in my chest and smiled instead. Slowly, the house stopped feeling quiet. Not loud in sound, but loud in presence. There were more voices, more movements, more energy that didn't belong to me. I stopped feeling relaxed. I became careful, always aware of where I was sitting, what I was touching, how much space I was taking up. I started cleaning after myself more than I needed to, wiping counters that were already clean, putting things away even when I was still using them. I didn't want to be in the way. They talked around me, not to me. Conversations happened over my head or behind closed doors. Plans were made when I wasn't in the room. I would hear bits and pieces, words floating through the hallway, and I would pretend I wasn't listening. Sometimes I wanted to ask questions, but the moment would pass, and I would tell myself it wasn't my place. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself I should be grateful that I had a roof over my head, that my son and his wife had taken me in. Gratitude became my shield. Every time something felt wrong, I pushed it down with a reminder of how lucky I was supposed to feel. But gratitude can slowly turn into silence, and silence can slowly turn into loss. I stopped sharing my opinions. I stopped asking for small favors. I stopped mentioning when something hurt my feelings. It felt easier to disappear a little than to risk being seen as a burden. At night, when the house finally grew quiet again, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. I prayed for patience. I prayed for understanding. I prayed that I wouldn't become bitter or resentful. I prayed that I would learn to accept this new version of my life. But I never prayed for courage. I never asked for the strength to speak up or to protect myself. Somewhere deep inside, I believed that staying quiet was the same as staying safe, and I didn't yet realize how much that silence was costing me. One afternoon, when the light outside felt dull and heavy, I heard footsteps that didn't belong to anyone I knew. They were slow and curious, moving from room to room, stopping, starting again. Doors opened softly. Drawers slid out and back in. Voices whispered, careful and low, like they didn't want to disturb something fragile. I stood still in the hallway, holding my breath, listening. My heart started beating faster, not because I was afraid, but because something felt wrong in a way I couldn't yet explain. I peeked around the corner and saw people I had never seen before. They were looking at the walls, the ceiling, the floors. One of them ran a hand along the kitchen counter, nodding. Another stepped into the living room and looked around with interest. Then I heard it, said so casually it almost sounded like a compliment meant for no one in particular. "Nice space," one of them whispered. That single sentence landed hard inside me. Nice space. Not home, not memories, not life, just space. Something that could be measured, evaluated, traded. I felt small standing there, like a guest in a place I had once owned with my whole heart. I walked toward my son and asked him what was happening. My voice was calm, but inside I was shaking. He didn't answer right away. He didn't meet my eyes. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor, then glanced toward the strangers as if hoping they would disappear. That silence told me more than any words could have. It told me he knew. It told me he had known for a while, and it told me that whatever was happening, it wasn't meant to include me. Later that week, the sign went up. For sale, big letters, bright colors, planted firmly in the front yard like a warning I couldn't ignore. I stood at the window and stared at it for a long time. Cars slowed down outside. People pointed. Some took pictures. Strangers were now looking at my life from the street, deciding if it was worth something to them. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house quietly, my steps careful, as if the walls might hear me. I stopped in the hallway and touched the wall with my fingertips. It was cool and familiar. This was the same wall where I had marked my children's heights year after year, little lines in pencil, names written beside them, dates I remembered without trying. I traced those marks slowly, my hand shaking. Those lines were proof that we had lived here, that we had grown here, that this place had watched us become who we were. My daughter-in-law saw me standing there and said, "It's better this way, you don't need a big house." Her tone wasn't cruel. It was practical, final, like the decision had already been weighed and settled, and my feelings were just something inconvenient left behind. That's when I realized something painful and clear. They had already decided. Long before the strangers walked through the house. Long before the sign went up. Long before I touched that wall for the last time. The choice had been made in quiet conversations I wasn't part of, in moments when my absence made things easier. And I had already been left behind, standing in a home that was no longer mine, holding on to memories that no longer had a place to live. The sale was finalized without me present. There was no meeting where my name was mentioned, no chair saved for me at a table where important papers were signed. I wasn't asked to come along. I wasn't told when it would happen. I found out the way you find out about things that no longer concern you, through short sentences and careful silences. There was no discussion, no moment where someone looked at me and said, "Are you okay with this?" There was no goodbye to the house that had been my life. It ended quietly, like a door closing in another room. The money went where I didn't see. It moved through accounts and plans that were never explained to me. Numbers were discussed in voices that dropped when I entered the room. Decisions were made quickly, confidently, without hesitation. And every one of those decisions went where I didn't matter. I could feel it in the way conversations stopped when I walked by, in the way eyes avoided mine when certain topics came up. It was as if my role in the story had already been written out, and everyone else had moved on to the next chapter. When I finally gathered the courage to ask where I would live, my voice came out softer than I expected. I asked carefully, politely, the way you ask a question when you're afraid of the answer. There was a pause after I spoke, a long one. It hung in the air between us, heavy and uncomfortable. My son shifted in his seat. He cleared his throat. He looked away. "We'll figure something out," he said. Those words were meant to sound reassuring. They were meant to calm me. But that pause before he spoke hurt more than yelling ever could have. It told me everything I needed to know. It told me there was no plan. It told me I wasn't considered when the future was being arranged. It told me I was an afterthought, something to be dealt with later. I nodded like I always did. I told myself not to push, not to make things harder than they already were. Inside, though, something sank quietly. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a slow, deep settling of sadness that felt permanent. When it came time to pack my things, I did it slowly. Not because I had many belongings left, but because each item carried a piece of who I was. I wrapped dishes carefully, remembering meals shared and hands that once passed them across the table. I folded clothes that still smelled faintly like the life I used to live. I picked up small objects that might have looked meaningless to anyone else but held entire stories for me. I found old photographs tucked into drawers, letters folded and refolded so many times the paper was soft. I sat on the bed and held them, letting the memories wash over me without fighting them. I wasn't rushing. There was nowhere I needed to be. That, too, hurt more than I expected. When I closed the door for the last time, I didn't cry. I didn't scream or fall apart. I just stood there, my hand resting on the handle, feeling empty. The house was quiet behind me, too quiet. I took one last look, not at the rooms, but at the space where my life had once fit so perfectly. Then I turned away, carrying what little I had left, stepping forward into a future that no one had thought to explain to me. I moved into a small rented room on a street I had never walked before, in a neighborhood that didn't know my name or my history. The room was clean but plain. One window faced a brick wall across the way, close enough that I could see the cracks in the mortar if I leaned forward. One bed sat against the wall, narrow and stiff, the kind that reminded you it was only meant for sleeping, not for dreaming. One chair stood beside it, wooden and straight-backed, like it didn't expect to be used for long conversations or lingering thoughts. That was all. No kitchen sounds drifting down the hallway. No familiar creaks under my feet. No memories resting quietly in the corners. The first night I lay there fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of a building that wasn't mine. Pipes knocked somewhere in the walls. A door slammed down the hall. Someone laughed outside, a sound that felt far away from me like it belonged to another life. The silence in that room was loud. It pressed against my ears, against my chest, against my thoughts. It wasn't peaceful. It was empty. At night, my mind became busy in ways it never had before. I thought about every moment I stayed quiet when I should have spoken. Every time I nodded instead of asking questions. Every smile I offered when my heart wanted to protest. I replayed conversations over and over, changing my answers in my head, imagining myself saying what I never said. The words came easily now, too easily, when there was no one left to hear them. I told myself it was too late. I told myself it wouldn't have changed anything. I told myself this was just how life went sometimes. Weeks passed, marked only by routine. I learned which floorboard creaked outside my door. I learned the sound of the neighbor's television through the wall. I learned how the light shifted across the room during the day, how it faded early in the afternoon, leaving the space feeling smaller and colder. I made simple meals. I folded my clothes carefully. I spoke to no one most days, and when I did, my voice sounded strange to my own ears, like it wasn't used to being heard anymore. Then weeks became months. Time stretched and thinned, losing its shape. Holidays came and went quietly. I watched them pass through shop windows and television screens, never touching me directly. I told myself I was fine. I told myself I was strong, but strength felt different now. It wasn't loud or proud. It was just survival, quiet and unnoticed. One evening, as the sky outside my window darkened earlier than usual, there was a knock on my door. The sound startled me. No one ever knocked. For a moment I just stood there, unsure, my heart beating faster than it had in a long time. When I opened the door, my son stood there, hands in his pockets, shoulders slumped. He looked tired. Older. Not just in years, but in weight. His eyes were dull in a way I had never seen before. The confidence he once carried so easily was gone, replaced by something fragile and uncertain. He didn't step inside right away. He just stood there, looking at me, like he wasn't sure he deserved to come in. "They're divorcing," he said finally. "And the money is gone." The words fell into the room and stayed there. He walked in slowly and sat down on the edge of the bed, his hands gripping his knees. His shoulders began to shake, and then he cried. Not quietly, not carefully. He cried like a child who had lost something and didn't know how to get it back. The sound of it filled the room, mixing with the silence, breaking it open. I stood there watching him, feeling something shift inside me. Not satisfaction, not relief, just a deep, aching understanding. For the first time, he looked at me not as someone who would always endure, always adapt, always forgive without question. He looked at me like someone who had been hurt, like someone who mattered. For the first time, he saw me. I didn't say, "I told you so." The words were there, somewhere deep inside me, but they never reached my mouth. I didn't remind him of the house, of the papers, of the quiet ways I had been pushed aside. I didn't list the moments when my voice had been ignored or my trust had been misplaced. I didn't do any of that, not because it didn't matter, but because in that moment, something else mattered more. I held his hand. His hand felt different than I remembered, rougher, colder. It trembled slightly in mine, like it wasn't used to being held anymore. I felt his pain moving through him, heavy and unsteady, and I recognized it. It was the same pain I had carried silently for so long. The pain of realizing too late that something precious had been taken for granted. Because motherhood doesn't end when children grow up. It doesn't end when respect disappears. It doesn't end even when love is tested and trust is broken. A mother's heart stretches in ways that don't always make sense, even to herself. Mine stretched again that night, quietly, without effort, without asking for anything in return. We didn't talk much. There was nothing left to explain. He cried until his breathing slowed, until his shoulders stopped shaking. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were red and tired, but there was something new there too. Awareness, regret, a kind of seeing that hadn't been there before. Over time, things changed. Not quickly, not easily, but they changed. He began to show up more. He asked questions. He listened, really listened, in a way he never had before. When he spoke, his voice was softer, careful, as if he finally understood that words could build or break, depending on how they were used. Later, he helped me buy a small place of my own. It wasn't the same house. It didn't have the old tree in the front yard or the marks on the wall that measured growing children. It didn't carry decades of memories or echoes of a life once lived, but it was truly mine. No shared decisions, no quiet paperwork, no feeling of being borrowed or temporary. The walls are plain. There are no cracks filled with stories, no corners heavy with the past, but they are quiet, the good kind of quiet, the kind that lets you breathe without fear, the kind that doesn't press down on you or make you feel small. In the mornings, sunlight comes in through the window, gentle and unhurried, and I sit with my tea without anyone watching, without anyone deciding what should happen next. Now I make decisions again. Small ones, ordinary ones, but they belong to me. I choose my mornings. I decide when to wake up, what to eat, when to rest. I choose what to keep and what to let go of. I choose my peace and I protect it carefully, like something fragile and precious. And here is what I learned, slowly, painfully, honestly. Love does not mean silence. Love does not ask you to disappear to make others comfortable. Family does not mean surrendering your voice or your worth, and kindness should never cost you your dignity. If it does, then something has gone wrong, even if it looks gentle on the surface. If you are listening to this and you feel invisible in your own life, please remember this. You are allowed to belong, not just to others, but to yourself. You are allowed to speak, even if your voice shakes. You are allowed to take up space, to ask questions, to protect what matters to you. And it is never too late to choose yourself. Not loudly, not angrily, but quietly, firmly, with the kind of strength that comes from knowing who you are and what you deserve.